So I think it's like almost time to start. Like, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ahmet Öztürk. I'm the Swedish Institute Fellow and the Kroc Fellow, Scholar in Residence at Kroc Institute. Thanks to Elena's invitation, today I'm going to moderate this lovely panel named the Linearity of Peace, Reflections from the Balkans and Beyond. I think it's quite an interesting subject for me to moderate because I'm a person who wrote his dissertation on the Balkans and spent like 3 years in the Balkans, and my mom side is coming from the Balkans, Albania to the Ottomans after sort of a conflict processes. So it's going to be quite interesting for me, and Elena's wildly and great questions about the border corrections between Kosovo and Serbia, and which aims to normalization process, and she raised quite good questions, namely, can peace in a multi-ethnic society ever be achieved, especially after periods of oppression, human rights violation, and in some cases acts of genocides? Secondly, what are the conditions that might allow that peace to take root, and what forms could it be take? Even though the like 3 of our speakers I'm gonna represent you soon are about the Balkans, but we know from the world history, particularly from the First World War and the Second World War, Balkans means not only Balkans. And Bahar conclude another quote-unquote area or problematic area than the Middle Eastern, Iraqi Kurdistan. She's gonna speak about it. Now we have 4 panelists, and we're gonna start with Elena Stavrevska, with Dr. Elena Stavrevska, visiting research fellow at Kroc Institute, and then we're gonna follow up with the Carli Steelman, PhD student in sociology and peace studies at the Kroc Institute. And thirdly, we're going to follow up Ernesto Verdeja, Associate Professor of Political Science and Peace Studies at Kroc Institute. And thirdly, Bahar Bashar, Associate Professor at Coventry University, and also visiting Research Fellow at Kroc University. It's a long Kroc Institute. They are rich, but not that rich, actually. Kroc Institute. I mean, even though, like, speakers, mostly from Mediterranean, Balkans, and the Middle East, I am quite strict about timing. You have 10 minutes, and then, because, like, it's late and we are end of the semester, you have 10 minutes to open up or scrutinize these questions, and I think there will be a Q&A session, and then we're going to say bye. Ellen, floor is yours.
Thank you. You're one of the few people here who can actually pronounce my last name. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Kosovo and Serbia and the latest development in the relations between these 2 countries. Before I go into that, how many of you are familiar with the history of Kosovo-Serbian relations? Okay, so I'll start with the slide that I call How Not to Do a History of 2 Countries in 2 minutes or less. So speaking of the Ottomans, the relations between what is today Kosovo and what is today Serbia have always been tense for centuries. In fact, before the Ottomans, in the 12th century, Kosovo was the heart of the Serbian Empire at the time. It is the heart of the Serbian Orthodox Church, or the headquarters of the Serbian Orthodox Church, and it is related to a lot of different folk, let's call them myths, or narratives that are related to the Serbian nationhood as a whole. I am trying to focus on the things that pertain to the current status. So with the end of the Second Balkan War, and then with the Second World War, Kosovo, as part of Serbia, was integrated in Yugoslavia. Now, within Yugoslavia, importantly, and this is very important, in 1974 it was given autonomous rights. It was declared as one of the 2 autonomous provinces. So it wasn't one of the republics, but it had a large degree of self-government. On the eve of the Balkan Wars of the 90s, Slobodan Milošević, the then president of what was remaining of Yugoslavia, moved to remove this autonomous rights of Kosovo. And as it always happens, one thing led to another. In the 1990s, the ethnic Albanians in Kosovo declared independence. For those who don't know, Kosovo's population at the time was mixed. They are the ethnic Albanians, who were predominantly Muslim, There were the ethnic Serbs, who were predominantly Christian Orthodox, and there are also several other minorities. And I will not go into that now, but during the Q&A we can. So then, in the remaining of the 1990s, Serbia was a bit busy fighting wars elsewhere. I think Carli and Ernesto will talk about it. And then at the end of the 1990s, there was an actual open conflict between the Serbian police, still considering Kosovo as part of its territory, and the newly formed Kosovo Liberation Army. This was concluded in March of 1999 with, some of you might be familiar, with the NATO bombing of Serbia once peace negotiations failed. And after 78 days of airstrikes, Serbian troops were finally withdrawn from Kosovo. This resulted in quite a few deaths, and I'm not talking just about the airstrikes. The airstrikes also resulted in civilian deaths in Serbia. But this tension between, or the war, the conflict between Serbia and Kosovo resulted in by some estimates, some 10,000 deaths on the Kosovo side, and also several hundred deaths on the Serbian side as well. These figures might be controversial depending on who you speak to. So do not cite me on that, but these are some of the estimates that are more widely used. In any case, what we ended up with is the territory, at that time, territory of Kosovo under UN governing, under the so-called UNMIK, or the United Nations Interim Administrative Mission in Kosovo, which lasted until 2008 when Kosovo declared its independence. Some of you might remember this act, which, because it was one of the, until South Sudan was the newest formed country. And in 2008, Kosovo was importantly established as a multi-ethnic state. It's important because the people that remained in Kosovo, the Serbs that remained in Kosovo, were acknowledged in the constitution. Another thing that's important, especially given that both Serbia and Kosovo want to one day, the sooner the better for them, join the EU, which if you're from Britain, might be questioning why, but they do have these aspirations towards EU membership. What is problematic for Kosovo is that the statehood of Kosovo is not actually officially recognized by the EU as a whole. It is recognized by most of its member states, but 5 remain against it. They largely remain against it because of their own Kosovos inside their borders. So there's Romania, and it's problematic. I don't think it's problematic. Some call it the problematic region of Transylvania, which is populated by Hungarians largely. There's Slovakia, which has a region also populated by ethnic Hungarians. There's Cyprus, with the Turkish part of Cyprus being an independent entity. And there's Greece, always backing Cyprus naturally. And of course, there's also Spain with the Catalan region. So you see the logic there is not so much about what Kosovo is in and of itself, but what it represents for the other countries and what kind of precedent it sets. Now, the EU, being aware that this is an issue for happening in its background and is really challenging its state as a foreign policy actor as a whole, has been leading negotiations between the two countries, which in 2013 resulted with the landmark so-called Brussels Agreement. Now, as part of that agreement, there was the agreement foresaw several things, including the formation of the so-called Association of Serb Municipalities. Now, the purple territory is Kosovo, but the green parts in it are the majority Serbian municipalities. That is not to say that they're purely Serbian, but they're majority Serbian. So there's 4 municipalities in the northern part of Kosovo, and there's 6 so-called enclave municipalities. And the idea was that these municipalities will form an association. That, however, hasn't happened. Now, this brings us to 2018. So partition has been a fringe idea as far as not just Kosovo, I mean, the whole Yugoslav region is concerned for years. The idea behind the particular case of Kosovo is for the green areas in Kosovo, in northern Kosovo, not the enclaves, for the green areas in northern Kosovo to basically join Serbia and for Preševo Valley, which is part of Serbia, but is predominantly populated by Albanian population, to join Kosovo. Now it's interesting because for quite a while, this has been discussed, but it never entered the mainstream public discourse until July of 2018. Among other things, one important thing that happened, which I think will interest some of you, is that the then US ambassador, I mean, a lot of things changed with the Trump administration, including its stand on some of the Balkan politics, including Kosovo. So the US ambassador to Kosovo in July of 2018 said that partition is not an excluded option, as long as it's agreed by the two parties. Interestingly, and as a form of a change of course, the UN representative said the same thing. Britain and Germany are largely opposing this, fearing destabilization in the rest of the region, as Carli will talk about shortly. And Russia, being Russia, without being stereotypical about this, but it actually supports whatever the two countries agree. Now, another thing that happened in the summer of 2018 is a 28-year-long dispute between Greece and what is now North Macedonia was settled, changing the country's name and other things, but it was finally settled, and this gave wind behind the wings of the two leaders of the two countries. So the president of Serbia, who was actually an information minister under Milosevic, and the president of Kosovo, who was one of the leaders of the Kosovo Liberation Army, have started openly discussing at all sorts of different fora this idea of what they initially called partition, then it was moved to territory exchange, to finally be called border correction. And you see how the political implications of each of those is very difficult. Is very different, especially if you're a peace scholar or a historian, or if just generally know the history of the world, you would know how the partition is a problematic concept. Territory exchange, even, well, equally so probably. But border correction, that is just part of becoming a state. So this, it was received differently by different people. But it is interesting because some people approached it as just an issue between Kosovo and Serbia, and other people approached it as an issue of the region. The region, my region, has that history of the 1990s where the wars were led by this idea that I don't want to be a minority in your country when you can be a minority in my country. You can easily understand how a talk about border correction can trigger all sorts of different discussions around it. Now, what makes this interesting other than another development in global politics? It is interesting for peace scholars for at least two reasons. One is that Vučić and Tači use this idea of local ownership. If you're a peace scholar, you will have heard of the local churn, of let's empower the locals, let them decide. They have very, very wisely used this whole idea of, you have wanted us to have more ownership here. We have more ownership, we're proposing this. Why are you not supporting it? So they have very wisely used that. However, if you start unpacking and see what's happening on the ground, you see that in Kosovo, there's hardly any political party, including Tači's party, that actually supports this idea of partition or border correction or land swap. I'll call it land swap, but you know what I'm referring to. The civil society organizations from both countries have come together and have said this is not a wise idea. Among other things, what will happen with the Serbs living in Preševo Valley, and what will happen with the Kosovo Albanians living in the Drine part or in northern Kosovo, to say nothing of the Serbs that live in southern Kosovo, so the so-called enclave municipalities. And where does this end? How much more of ethnically homogeneous are we looking for? Similarly, not all, but many political parties in Serbia are against this idea. So this raises an important question, and I'm afraid that my part of the talk will raise more questions than provide answers, is who is the local? And can we talk, is it possible to talk about sustainable peace if we continue talking about local as a singular? I have my thoughts, but I'm not going to give them to you right now. So that is the first. And the second, and with that I will conclude, is the power disbalance that actually exists between the two countries. The two countries are not equal partners in any case. Kosovo, among other things, because of not the lack of recognition by the EU, is the only country in the region that actually needs visas to travel anywhere. Serbia blocks it from all the international organizations, therefore making a lot of international cooperation impossible and effectively isolating the country in many ways, including economically. The talks between the two countries have stopped in November 2018 when Kosovo imposed 100% tariffs on Serbian products. This is important because Kosovo, not being recognized by Serbia, doesn't have much of a leverage as far as sovereignty is concerned. So it actually exercised one of its very few acts of sovereignty and imposed tariffs. For this, Kosovo has been scolded by many, including by the US administration, in terms that are not just patronizing, they're downright colonial. But on the one hand, they're encouraged to proceed with solutions, and on the other hand, they absolutely must not exercise their sovereignty. So that raises the second question with which I will end. What is the alternative if the status quo is actually harmful on day-to-day basis for citizens? Kosovo citizens cannot travel. Their passports are not recognized in many places. Their diplomas are not recognized in many places. To say nothing of the Kosovo Serbs who are isolated from both sides. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Elena, and thank you so much for your 3 questions. And while the others gonna present their research, their findings, I just want to ask you one more question. Maybe you would like to consider it during the Q&A section. Like I'm working about religion and global politics, and we are in Notre Dame, and I found this presentations are perfect, but religion part is missing. So I just want to try fill this gap by asking something. As far as I know, the Kosovars are like around 60% Albanians ethnically, and these Albanians consider themselves Muslims, and the Serbians consider themselves Orthodox. And what is the? And I know like there are some outsider actors, Russia, for example, like guardianship of the Orthodox in the region, and Turkey, for example, like the guardian, historical guardian or big brother of the Muslims. What is these external actors and their religion diversities relations within this new normalization process, or it is like opening up or kick off a new kind of a competition among the different actors, religion-oriented powers? This is my question, and now I'm just moving to Carli to talk on Bosnia, right?
Yes.
Okay, the floor is yours, Carli.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So I am going to do a little bit about the history of Bosnia through the Dayton Accords. I think Ernesto is going to bring it into a more contemporary understanding of how these systems politics are not perpetuated. I suspect that I was brought on to this panel specifically because of the issues of ethnic homogeneity, right? This is a case study of ethnic homogeneity as the result of genocide, and it still leaves some really problematic areas that peace builders have to address. So this is a map of the 1991 census. So this is the distribution of population right before the outbreak of the war, which started in '92. So on the eve of the breakup of Yugoslavia, there was a referendum about declaring independence for this region, and it was the referendum. The vote was overwhelmingly yes, but it was boycotted by ethnic Serbs who were not in favor of the idea of dissolution as a separate entity. So at the outbreak of the war, what you have is a population that's really distributed partially as the result of high exogamy rates. So there are high rates of intermarriage. And over the course of the war, what you see is systematic violence being perpetrated by a lot of different sides. There's rampant ethnic cleansing. A tragic feature of this conflict is that systematic sexual assault is used specifically as a weapon of war. And estimates vary widely, with as many as 50,000 women being held in rape camps that are set up throughout the territory. So there are prolonged campaigns of violence. It takes the international community a very long time to intervene. Eventually they do, and they bring about and the resulting peace agreement is referred to as the Dayton Accords. So effectively what this does is partitions, so all of this in light blue becomes the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's in 10 cantons. They're divided between Bosniak Croats and Muslims with 2 mixed cantons. And so the light blue represents 51% of the country. This portion becomes Republika Srpska. This has been referred to. The resulting government has been referred to as possibly the most complex parliamentary government in the world. It's highly complex. So what you have is one country split by an interethnic boundary line. There is a federal government, but each of these administrations also have 2 separate governing apparatus where they both also have their own houses for all practical purposes. There's a tripartite presidency, so there are 3 presidents that rotate every 8 months, and they're elected on the basis of their national identity. So there's a Bosnian Muslim, well, religion is not a necessary sufficient condition, but a Bosnian representative, a Croat representative, and a Muslim representative. So you're not allowed to hold multiple ethnic identities when you vote. So you vote for a representative on the basis of a singular ethnic identity, which means that for all practical purposes, the Constitution institutionalizes ethnic identity as a valid political cleavage. So there was a 2013 census done. The results were not released until 2016 because the political implications of changing representation were extreme. So there are 3 statistics bureaus in Bosnia. The Federation, this is the Federation's data. The Statistical Agency in Republika Srpska actively contests this, and it has to do with the methodology. So the Federation wanted to count non-permanent residents who had been absent in the 12 months prior because it weights the distribution toward Bosniak and Croat individuals. Republika Srpska wanted to exclude those for being available. And just to give the author of this some shine, this is actually a really difficult map to produce because the administrative boundaries change from census to census. So this required a lot of wizardry, so good for him. But the point that I wanted to make is that on the basis of the 2013 census, Bosniaks now make up 50% of the population, Serbs 30, and Croats 15. Their other category, which includes Jews and Roma, are a little bit over 2.5% of the population, and they find themselves very, very poorly represented in the system, specifically because electoral politics are tied to ethnic identity. Also, what this map shows is that the distribution of the population systematically sorts in the aftermath of ethnic cleansing. So 92% of all Bosnian Serbs live in Republika Srpska, 91% of Bosnian Croats, and 88% of Bosnian Muslims live in the Federation. So I think the point here is that what you have in this case is highly homogenized zones. And I think Ernesto is going to talk a little bit about the ability to say that piece of the time.
Well, it's so good to finish up. Elena, as a Balkan woman, give me a duty that you have to ask questions right after the answers, and I have to obey that as a person knows the region. But I would love to raise a question on Carli, Actually, I don't like to go to the classics, but right now I think Maria Todorova is right. If I'm not mistaken, in the first 10 page of the Imagining the Balkans, this very classical book, in every person who wants to work on the Balkans had to read it, and she discussed about what is this ethnic identities and what is the difference between ethnic identity and the religion identity. In the map, not this one, but maybe you may show it like two previous one, or yes, this one. In here, for example, ethnic populations. They divided ethnic populations. I can't see over there because I don't have my glasses. Muslim, Croats, and Serbs. So I'm from Turkey. I am Muslim. Am I Bosnian? Or how you can compare Muslims and Serbs? That should be something different, right? My question is that while we are talking about the ethnic differences, how are you going to consider these things? Because the Muslim, being a Muslim is the religion identity, but being a Serb is a national identity and ethnic identity at the same time. But what we know that all of these gray or complicated identity definitions, or the complicated identity definition, is the one of the reasons of these conflicts. Like in Macedonia, the river divided the Skopje into two pieces, and these people have been living in the same geography more than 500 years old, but they are defining themselves as Turk Muslims, Orthodox. But they're Albanian Muslims at the same time. But like, it is so complicated being Turk, Muslim, Serbian. So how you can read that complicated identity, religion complications? For me, it's a little bit irrational, but it's historically rational over there. So how did you read on these normalization process of the Balkans? This is my question. You're gonna end it up at the end of the day. Ernesto, please, it's your turn.
Great, thank you. So I was going to say a little bit about, I was asked basically to speak a bit about kind of reconciliation and peace more generally, and then think about it in the context of Bosnia. I know most about Bosnia in the context of genocide, so I spent a little bit of time there and I studied genocide. Though I am by no means an expert on Bosnia and Herzegovina, I'm by no means an expert on the Balkans, so my study of this is a little bit more kind of a broader comparative perspective. So thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to be on this, and I'll give some comments on this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a bit about kind of how to envision reconciliation, what some of the elements might be in the broader debates, and talk about kind of the current political situation of where we are in Bosnia right now, given these types of debates, because this has actually boiled up to the international level. So it's kind of a big policy question right now. And then finally end with what are possibly some ways forward. Spoiler alert, the ways forward are pretty bad. Right? It's a really bad situation right now. It's kind of a paralysis or a frozen conflict in many respects. So one place to start, of course, is thinking about what is meant by reconciliation. It's a term that you often find in countries that are deeply divided that everyone kind of detests. They detest it because there is this large international human rights community, civil society activists, diplomats, etc., who use the language all the time, and it seems to have embedded in a whole sense of kind of strategic and political claims within it. But nevertheless, the term reconciliation, the concepts of peace as well, consistently emerge in these contexts, and that's not surprising, given the types of challenges that these societies face. So what you see is, of course, a number of different ways of understanding reconciliation. One way of understanding reconciliation, given that it's a highly contested term, is that some people equate reconciliation with an exceptional focus on one group, normally their group. So reconciliation is equated with an emphasis on suffering, on victim claiming, or on claims of authenticity of a particular group. So to reconcile is to give special recognition to the particular experiences of that group. Reconciliation is only possible on those terms, which makes it a kind of monological concept. Another way of thinking about reconciliation, which you also see in this context, is the idea of reconciliation as forgive and forget. So we should forget the past and move forward. This is something that you see used by a certain segment of the Bosnian Serbian elite. By no means all. It's actually pretty complex. But certainly by a segment of them. So there's a sense of, it's that old Freudian joke about the kettle, right? Kind of if you don't know the joke, I'll say it later. But basically, what I mean by that in this case is a kind of a claim of there might have been mass violence, and that's really a shame, but there probably wasn't. We didn't do it, and even if we did, let's forgive and forget and move forward, because the future is more important than the past. So it's all of these kinds of evasions. But even if we take these kinds of real political struggles seriously, I think we can lay out, for the purposes of our conversation, some idea of reconciliation, as it's normally understood both in the literature and also among practitioners, and I would kind of lay it out this way. I'd say that we can think of reconciliation as some kind of morally defensible form of coexistence, which includes a number of different types of normative claims. These are claims, they're normative claims, they're not claims that these have been made or achieved. But they're normative claims that kind of give some sense of meat to the idea of reconciliation. So first, that reconciliation must require a full set of legal rights and also the inclusion of the rule of law. Secondly, some understanding of accountability, where the understanding of accountability is more complete in these types of circumstances. Third, that reconciliation requires attending to the needs of victims and survivors in some respect, and we can have a whole set of debates and discussions about what this entails. Fourth, that reconciliation normally involves some idea of a shared community, so kind of a we. Notice that the term reconciliation has the term RE within it, so it implies this kind of making whole what has been smashed, to use the old language of Walter Benjamin, among others. It's misleading, because sometimes in societies there hasn't been any whole that has been smashed, but I think in this case, some kind of argument can be made for that. And then lastly, reconciliation includes some kind of claim about historical reckoning. Historical reckoning means actually facing the past and all the kind of complexities of the consequences that follow from the past. And this involves some kind of distinction, at least conceptually, though in practice it's very hard to make, between guilt and responsibility. So making a claim of responsibility, saying that one as a member of the polity has a responsibility for what has happened to kind of confront it, is different from saying that you directly, because of your identity, are guilty of what happened in place X, Y, or Z. So we can draw that kind of distinction, even though in practice it can be complex. If that's the case, I would argue, and this helps kind of for the second part that I'm about to jump into, I would argue that for thinking about reconciliation as a kind of a political reconciliation, we need to divide it at least into 4 different levels for heuristic purposes, though in practice it gets complex again. One is at the level of elite discourse. How do elites talk about reconciliation? How do they find ways of negotiating and kind of working together? And also, what are the evasions? What's left out? We all know about elite negotiated transitions and elite negotiated pacts that leave out the claims of civil society. But there's an elite level of analysis here. Secondly, for reconciliation purposes, there's also a level of institutional governance and institutional apparatus. Everything from the rule of law to how the government actually works, processes of representation, who's included, who's excluded, etc. Say a little bit about that in a moment. Thirdly, reconciliation requires attending to the importance of civil society and the kinds of pressures that civil society groups can lay to bear on political elites and political parties and governing institutions as well. Now, when I say civil society, I mean it in an analytical, not normative sense. What I mean by that is civil society is certainly valuable and important, but we shouldn't assume that more civil society is necessarily good. Some civil society movements are very, very problematic. So we have to be careful, kind of a pitfall of some ways of thinking of these studies, equating reconciliation with all, or civil society with always good. Sometimes they're problematic, as we know in this case. And then fourthly, there's a level of reconciliation that deals with interpersonal. That's several degrees removed from the political, from the public, and it deals with how people coexist with one another. My sense is that any account of reconciliation has to not only make these analytical distinctions, but in addition to that, be careful about assuming that they all fit together perfectly. These processes and logics have their own kinds of dynamics to them. So we have to be a little careful of assuming, for instance, that achieving reconciliation, however defined at one level, necessarily promotes it at another level. It can work across purposes. So if we use this kind of rough outline of how to think of reconciliation, what do we find in the current case of Bosnia and Herzegovina? You've already heard a little bit about the way the country is divided, the way it's set up. You have a system, a political system that has a tripartite presidency with 2 legal entities for 3 identifiable ethnic communities, with each multiple internal governments as well as cantonments. So for instance, you have a president who represents the Serbian population at the tripartite level, but there's also a president of the Republika Srpska. In addition to that, there's a prime minister that has to be picked through the tripartite system. There are multiple levels of complexity here. In addition to that, you have the ongoing observation from the outside at the EU level, among other levels. So there's a lot of different kinds of actors here. So what do we see in Bosnia and Herzegovina? I started off by saying that the country is really in kind of bad shape. There is nothing like reconciliation, even in a minimal sense, in the country. And I think this is a product of several things. One, that there's a fractured and ineffective political elite. Secondly, and this is related to it, that the government itself, because of its multiple different types of institutional levels of functioning, it incentivizes fractionalization. It incentivizes a kind of factionalism. And because of that, you effectively have, for instance, today, the government is not fully formed. There were elections last fall in October. The government actually isn't completely operating yet. This is because of the kind of paralysis that's a product of the institutional system. I'll say something about that at the very Related to this is just largely an ineffective and convoluted governing system. But in addition to this, there's also just the question of widespread corruption. And this is a really important point. It's not just about political identity. There's also the institutionalization of corruption at many levels inside of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The OSCE recently put out a report noting the deep levels of corruption within the entire judicial system across both entities. In addition to this, we see this kind of not only fractionalization of the political elite, but radicalization of the political elite. The best example here is the representative of the Serbs in the tripartite presidency, Milorad Dodik, someone who's kind of been kicking around for a long time. So even if you follow the politics in a cursory fashion, you'll see this. This is a gentleman who is a genocide denier. So, you know, go figure. He's not committed clearly to the idea of one country. He recently said just about a week and a half ago that the country's quote, already separated but has not yet been announced. That was his claim. He's a right-wing nationalist. And most recently, just to give you a sense of kind of, again, that this isn't only about identity, but it's about institutional problems and security dilemmas. He's proposed creating an auxiliary police force in the Republika Srpska, which would be in addition to the current police force, which risks being highly ideological and also heavily militarized. In addition, so that's Dodik is kind of capturing that kind of complexity. In addition, there is the problem of the division of the educational system, which has been a problem since almost the Dayton Peace Accords. Young people largely get an education within their kind of broader ethnic community, and they're not exposed to the experiences of others, which perpetuates a sense of divisionism. And this is kind of what's going on internally. Externally, what you also see is heavy support from Russia, as my colleague said, and European right-wing extremists, particularly for the Republika Srpska extremist political elites. Not all of them are extremists, but many are. The European Union has not clearly focused on Bosnia-Herzegovina or the Balkans, except on questions of immigration. So interest has fallen, except for the idea of kind of creating a wall to prohibit immigrants coming from elsewhere. The United States has shown little leadership, little interest in the region. This has become worse under President Trump, not surprisingly. I mean, it's not a dig, it's an objective. It's, you can't disagree with that. And last, kind of the last point I want to emphasize here is that there are problems of institutional governance mechanisms. I mentioned earlier, these problems are showing their age, but there's a deep irony here, right? The paradox effectively is that this institutional system was understood to be necessary at the end of the wars in the 1990s as a way of achieving a kind of negative peace in our language. At the same time, it incentivizes the divisive group politics in place since the war. So this is the old debate among political scientists between kind of consociationalism versus other forms of separate governance structures. And here we see consociationalism proving to be really, really detrimental. So what do we have here? Ways forward. It's pretty difficult. One is to address the question of institutional paralysis, but there doesn't really seem to be sufficient leadership to address this. Secondly, addressing questions of political discourse and problems of historical memory, and really confronting the idea of what it means to have a collective identity. There's really no significant movement on this among the political elite, those there are also society claims. There's a deep question of corruption, there's a deep question of the educational system I mentioned. And then lastly, you have kind of a classic security dilemma. And the security dilemma is not a security problem. It's different. The security dilemma is one where every actor acting rationally produces a suboptimal outcome. What I mean by that in this case is the different groups, the extremists among the different groups, are essentially arguing that they need to protect themselves. And in protecting themselves, that's a defensive claim, but the defensive claim signals the possibility of offensive use. That's the problem here with the auxiliary police force in the Republika Srpska. So already several leaders among the Bosniaks and even the Croats inside of Bosnia-Herzegovina have signaled that they will arm and create an auxiliary military force themselves as well. I mean, as you see it, if you travel through Republika Srpska, you already see kind of, even in the borders between the two entities, you already see just how strong some of these divisions are. So it's signaling these kinds of problems of a security dilemma, and security dilemmas are very hard to resolve without some kind of power that can impose a sense of minimal peace. And that's eroding very quickly. I could say more about some of the immigration problems, but I think that's not there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ernesto. Like, it was a lovely presentation, starting from Benjamin, who is very famous on the streets of the Balkans, and like coexistence, reconciliation. But like, you mentioned a couple of things about problems, like corruption, non-functional civil society, very weak and diverse governments. They're not surprising for me, like, when we are talking about the Balkans, these political and the civil society institutions are historically quite weak, like it may be because of the colonialism, their Ottoman background, and their stuck position are the reasons. But I wonder, what is your suggestion, solution suggestion? Because if we gonna cut it short, and suggest a strong leadership, there is a possibility these strong leadership mechanism can be influenced by the newly emerging populist, let's say repressive/authoritarian leaders like Hungary and Serbia or Turkey and Russia. So I just wondered that what is your suggestion about the newly emerging reconciliation or living together in these very diverse structures? Okay, thank you so much again. And now we are passing Turkey and shifting to the Middle East, and Bahar gonna talk about the tensions between the central Iraqi government and the KRG, Kurdistan Regional Government, post-referendum process, which means right after this September 2017, right?
Yeah.
Floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Elena, for organizing this panel. It's a pleasure to be here and present my research. So I'm not an expert on disputed territories in Iraq, but I have been working on Iraqi Kurdistan for a long time, since 2012, and I've been following state building and nation building processes. They're mostly focusing on how the diaspora is contributing to these processes, but I'm also working on the politics of genocide recognition and commemorating Anfal, and how there's a clash between local commemoration practices and the elite-driven remembrance. So I'll just try to bring insights to this topic from these perspectives as well. So Iraqi Kurdistan, or the former name Kurdistan Regional Government, is the only formal manifestation of Kurdish aspirations for statehood. There's also Rojava, a region in Syria at the moment, but when we look at a legal official agreement, we only see a state-like mechanism in Iraqi Kurdistan. So it started flourishing after 1991 uprisings. I'll come to that, but just let me give you a brief historical background. I'm very bad with preparing PowerPoint, so I just put not that and that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I am teaching ethnic conflicts and political violence, and most of my case study starts with the sentence when the British left, they left a mess behind, and this was the case. This is the case for South Palestine, Cyprus, Sri Lanka, whatever you call, and it's the same for Iraq. So Iraq is it was considered as a pan-Arab state, but it's actually a patchwork. It's after the collapse of the Ottomans, it was put together. The borders were drawn by not the people who actually live in the state, but by others. It's imposed on people, and so of course it is considered by many scholars as a failed state-building project to start with. So if you look at history books, many people would actually say that they created Iraq, but they couldn't create the Iraqis. So this was the case especially for the Kurds, who had a distinct cultural and political and linguistic identity compared to Arabs. So they are a totally different ethnic group. And there were some Kurdish uprisings starting from the 1920s, and there were episodes where no conflict happened between these two groups. It depended on the mobilization of tribes/political parties in the Kurdish region at that time. But there was a kind of agreement between the central government and the Kurds after a couple of uprisings in the 70s. But Iraqi government failed to deliver their promises, and they also did some kind of population engineering and brought a lot of Arabs to places where we call disputed territories right now. One of the critical junctures, if you consider Kurdish and Iraqi central government relations, one of the critical junctures were actually the Anfal campaign that the Saddam regime proceeded against the Kurds, which included also the Halabja attack. So it's considered as genocide. It's recognized as genocide by the Iraqi High Tribunal after the fall of Saddam as well. So basically, many Kurds were attacked by Saddam's army, and they used chemical gas. Many people perished, and many people were displaced during these campaigns, and it has a very important place. It lies at the nation building project, which I'll come to in a minute. So in the 90s, after Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, there were again some Kurdish uprisings in the region, and the conflict between the central government and the Kurds took a very drastic form, so that the international community intervened and established a no-fly zone on the 36th parallel. And this basically helped the Kurds to, have a sort of autonomy at that time. So the gradual autonomy can be considered to have started in 1992 onwards. And then when we look at the next critical juncture, it will be the invasion of Iraq. I call it invasion of Iraq. You might be calling it when US brought democracy to Iraq. It's up to you, but it definitely empowered the Kurds. It did one positive thing, in my opinion. It empowered the Kurds. So basically, after the fall of Saddam, Kurds guaranteed their autonomous position in the Iraqi federal state by the 2005 constitution. So when we look at the literature now, many scholars would define the Iraqi Kurdistan situation as like quasi-state, de facto state. Nina Kasperson says it's in a state of incremental secession. So it can act independently on many things. It has its own army, it has its own courts, its own system, own elections, parliament, president, prime minister, whatever you call. And the Kurdish identity, as I said before, is completely distinct from the Arab identity. But Kurdistan cannot be independent, and I'll come to the reasons why. But when the Kurdistan region started flourishing after 2005, and they were really active. They opened representations all around the world in the capitals, and they could use power diplomacy very well. Kurdish fighters, once who were fighters, they became really good politicians who knew how to deal with Western powers. And Kurdistan also started acting like a state, although it wasn't a state. Many people started calling it a state within a state. But if you looked really closely, it was very easy to understand that there were two main parties, KDP and PUK, and they had also their own disputes. So if you, for example, see Hevler, the capital of the Kurdistan region right now, and Süleymaniye, which is called Suli in short version, there was a huge difference. So when I was in the region and I was traveling from one place to another, I actually saw a state within a state, meaning Kurdistan region, and then a state within the Kurdistan region, which meant Suli. Because in these two provinces, they have their own leaders. At that time, it was Talabani and Barzani in Hevler, and then they have their own soldiers, their own Peshmerga. So, there was no unity. So there were a lot of Kurdish nationalisms within the state building project, but there was no unification among Kurdish groups either. So the region started booming. It was called the second Dubai in the region. It received a lot of oil revenues from the central government. It established its own treaties with different countries, and it attracted a lot of FDI. So these were all positive until the region went into a war against the Islamic State. And this really drastically changed things. The economic crisis started, and then there were tensions between the Iraqi central government and the KRG. When they couldn't receive the money, they couldn't pay the salaries, the teachers to civil servants, to Peshmerga, and it created a lot of problems. Despite all these, in 2017, the region held a referendum for independence. This was not the first time the political leadership actually came up with this idea, but it surprised many, including myself and many others who are working on the region for a very long time, because we could see that there was state building going on in the region. You can feel it, you can smell it in the air. But when it comes to the timing, there was something wrong about it, because it was a time when the war with ISIS just ended, the parliament was suspended, the president was, sitting in his place for more than his legitimate time, and also not all the Kurdish political parties who were in the parliament were supporting an independence referendum, but they still went for it, and the results were like this. So 92.73% voted in favor of the referendum. And the results of the referendum were drastic. First of all, they have received almost no sympathy from the international community. Unlike Kosovo, they didn't even have one single supporter except Israel. And when Israel declared their support for Kurdish independence, it actually backfired because many states in the region then started calling Kurdish independence as an Israeli project, and this harmed their image as well. For example, in Turkey, Turkish media use a lot of these news to criminalize Kurdish demands for self-determination. So I'll go back to, and this map shows the KDP and the PKK and the differences, and this is from the towns where there were disputes between the two parties. So you could see they are clearly divided by a border as well. And then I'll come back to the disputed area. So one thing before I continue, so the political leadership uses many reasons to declare independence, because they can actually act like a state, but also Anfal, being a victim of genocide by the central government, is also one of their main motivations, and they use this. They use the Israeli example and Armenian example. They take these two cases as role models, and they think that a recognition of Anfal as a genocide will give them the opportunity to claim Earth sovereignty and pursue self-determination. Maybe not now, but in the future. But at the same time, the reactions to the referendum clearly showed that the international community actually did not care much about that. But the narrative around Anfal and Halepce cases are at the heart of the nation-building narrative, because it's in school books, it's in everywhere. They have a ministry specifically dedicated to Anfal and the martyrs. And if you go to Kurdistan now, you find less and less people, for example, especially the youth who speak Arabic, they are completely separated from the Iraqi area. When it comes to disputed territory, so after 2017 independence referendum, of course the central government reacted negatively to this referendum, and the political leadership in Kurdistan did not cancel the results. So what happened was like, if you look at it's just 2 minutes and all. Okay, 2 minutes.
How I can say no?
So when we come to after the referendum, the disputed territories came into, they became a debate matter again, because after in the Constitution, in Article 140, determines what disputed areas are, but there is a discrepancy in definition. So they say Kirkuk and other areas, so we actually don't know the situation and what will happen and how they will be resolved. So you can see in the map, who controls where, and you can see the disputed areas in between. So after the war against the Islamic State, the Kurdish forces actually managed to take over most of the disputed areas, and especially among them, Nineveh, Kirkuk, Salahuddin, and Diyala. Kirkuk is one of the most important ones because it has the oil fields. So basically, in 2014, Kurdish regional government managed to control all these areas. But after the referendum, the Iraqi army advanced and took back the territory, and now the Kurdish region lost actually most of the territory that they gained, and they went back to the borders of 2003. So nobody knows how they can solve this issue right now, but there have been 2 very important elections, and now there is a transition period, and both sides are aware that good governance is needed, and that they want to resolve this without the intervention of the international community. So I can elaborate on this in the QA section.
Thank you so much, Bahar. First of all, let me say that you are not alone using starting your articles with the British example. We are using with the Ottoman example, but I don't want to involve this question. It's about colonialism, and Marco's going to jump the floor if I'll continue. I have a question, not directly about your presentation, maybe about one of the backbones of your presentation. You mentioned the Iraqi Kurdistan regional government. You defined a state within a state. From my theoretical knowledge, most of the Southeastern European authoritarian leaders defined their oppositional groups as the state within a state or a parallel state. Then I just look at the literature about it. It's the person, Robert Tuckson, Columbian University professor, defined these state within a state structures and the parallel state structures, defined the newly emerging fascist groups within the Nazi regime. So how did you define this region as a state within a state, or you are like using Robert Tuckson or another different theory, or just like is there like fruitful or suitable definition for them? This is my question, not direct about your presentation. Now we have approximately half an hour, and the floor is yours. If you want, you can reflect my question, or you can collect the questions first, or answer later on. It's up to you. Okay, is there any questions, guys? I think they are.
I can start. Yeah, there are many questions came to my mind as you were speaking. Some thoughts about Carli cases that came to my mind. One was the issue of identities, for instance. The question you posed about the map, Muslims versus what was the Bosnians and Serbs?
Serb and Croat.
Serbs and the Croat, and then the Muslims. And I was thinking about actually my neck of the wood, Israel-Palestine, where there is also confusion between religion and national ethnic. And so I don't think it's unique for the Balkans, and you see it in many other cases where, in the context of Israel-Palestine, it's Jews versus Arabs. But these definitions are actually so fluid. The more you zoom in into them, you see how they do not hold water. But for the sake of maps, for the sake of generalizations, it's always easier to draw these, to make these. So this is one point to consider. The map actually could be, I don't know who drew this map, but cartographers have political agendas, and that could be reflected in the map that was seen. That was just one observation that I was having. I can go and just give a few more quick observations. When I heard the presentations about the Balkans, I kept waiting for the word consociationalism until it came from Ernesto only once, and in negative tone. And obviously, in the 1960s and 70s, this was the key word to explain how how it all works out so perfectly. But nobody is using this term anymore. And I wonder if, the political scientists among you, if you can reflect a little bit, is it a term that is still being used in analysis of the Balkans? Because this was the key. You want to understand Yugoslavia?
Yeah.
But nobody is doing. I think this is a term that is not being used anymore, but you can correct
The EU just gave a lot of money to a certain group of people to actually study this.
to
study this, so there's still people out there.
Yeah. Last but not least, it's really fascinating to think about Iraq and the Kurds using the Anfal campaign as a historical moment that shapes their national identity, but not only inward, but also outward, comparing their case with the Armenian genocide or the Holocaust, Jewish Holocaust in the Second World War. Of course, this would not, take them far in their negotiations with Turkey. And the Kurds in northern Iraq will never get independence, full independence, unless the Turkish government allowed them to. So drawing any, the word, even using the word genocide, would immediately turn off the. I wonder if I can speak about that.
So, Marcus.
So, Dr. Stavrevska, I can't say it.
Not bad.
Good job. Stavrevska. Is that a little better?
There's a V.
Where the Spanish accent helped a little. You brought a really interesting question in that sort of a dichotomy in relationship to homogeneity and multiplicity. And I wonder whether your presentation was, in a sense, slightly different to the other three presentations. Because I wondered, I know very little about the work of all four of you. So I guess the question is whether in your presentation you were sort of more calling for us to rethink the possibility of multiplicity in the sense of the problems of conceiving the identity within a particular territory in a singular kind of way. You can fragment it all you want, all the way to the individual, but that still becomes a problem that remains to be a problem as long as you attach identity and singularity to something out there. And I wonder whether that question of multiplicity is sort of taken in a different way in the other three presentations. I wonder whether the other three presentations had a little bit more of a sort of anxiety in relationship to difference, a little bit more of a the singularity of these ethnic notions are a problem for mapping or a problem for corruption or a problem for the state. However, can we solve this issue continuing on, still thinking within a singularity, or do we have to move on? So I wonder whether there's a difference between the presentation which addresses something that is symptomatic to a long more than the region. There's a problem of difference. Singularity is knocking on everybody's doors when we think of globalization.
Thank you, Marcos. Another question?
I just a follow-up question that relates to Turkey, and I think there's also Iranian response to
Yes.
So for the motivation over here.
so it's quite complex. It's not just only Iranian state, but also Kurdish movement in Iran and also PKK. What are their responses to this kind of idea of independent state and so on? Independent state, Kurdish state.
Any more questions? So I think if there is no more questions, there will be. We have plenty of times, and I can maybe give like everybody like 5 to 7 minutes to respond all the question or like conclude or add something to their presentations. Starting from Elena.
Well, let me start by saying thank you to everyone for agreeing to be on this panel. You all thank me, so now I feel rude for nothing. Thank you, thank you for coming. That said, so it's very strange for me to be on a panel where I don't talk about Bosnia. Well, I'm a Balkan panel where I don't talk about Bosnia, which is the country where I spend most of my research time. But something that Erdi asked me, and then there was a question later on as well, is this idea of identity, right? And what role does religion play? Interestingly, in the Yugoslav case, the first time the Bosniaks were referred to in the federal constitution, they weren't referred to as Bosniaks, they were referred to as Bosnian Muslims. So there were Serbs, Croats, so on, and Bosnian Muslims as an actual identity of the republic, so to say, or identity, not of the republic, sorry, of the people who lived in Bosnia. And then later that was moved to Bosniaks, which are Bosnian Muslims. One reason, what I have found in my research, but also it's not mind-blowing to people who know the region, is that in the case of Bosnia, there's not much of a difference between the different people populating the country. They speak the same language, they look the same way. It is only the religion that actually had, so during the conflicts, it was the religion that was played out.
The narcissism of minor differences.
Indeed. And so in a chapter of mine where I talk about spatial governmentality, you actually see how different religions claim the spaces, and they are simultaneously used. So for instance, a lot of people would ask, or would say, oh, I'm Orthodox, meaning I'm Serb, or I'm Muslim, meaning I'm Bosnian. They use simultaneously the two things. So the alphabet, the religion, and the ethnicity are used as kind of identity markers to also claim spaces. So you see a lot of flags from different, predominantly Muslim countries around the country to kind of mark different territories. as well. And that is different in Kosovo because in Kosovo they speak different language. So one speaks Albanian and the other speaks Serbian, so they actually cannot communicate with each other without learning the other language, which in one case is the language of the oppressor, or the colonizer. I won't call it colonizer, but the oppressor. So it's a form of resistance in a way to not learn the Serbian language, right? So religion doesn't play that big of a role. It plays a role, especially with the Serbian Orthodox Church being headquartered there, but it doesn't play that big of a role. It is the ethnicity within which there's also religion involved. The question of external actors, I actually think it's very interesting because when I write and when I talk today, I find this tension of what are the international actors to do? Because obviously in the case of Kosovo, they are actually causing harm by validating Serbia, by validating their idea of progress while playing a narrative of victimhood at home, and actually having very suppressive policies inside. They are excluding Kosovo in many ways. But at the same time, if they do nothing, who wins or who is? So, for instance, in the case of Bosnia, there were protests in 2014, which was the first type of progressive movement we've seen since the war, really. When young people got into the streets and they said, "We are hungry in 3 languages. We don't care about your national politics or nationalist politics. We want progress." And then the EU came in and said, "Okay, we hear you." And even though their protests were against austerity and against privatization, the EU said, "Okay, here is our suggestion for more austerity and more privatization." So really, I don't know what's worse when they're listening or when they're not listening. I'm really not sure. Two final thoughts and then I'll conclude. On power sharing, actually in the Balkans, there's, shocking as it may be, there's a learning curve, which is an awkward one. So they learned from Bosnia, so they didn't do the same thing in Macedonia, even though there's a power sharing arrangement. It's actually not as paralyzing as in the case of Bosnia. And then in Kosovo, it's even better in terms of functioning. That said, actually, there's people recently, 2 years ago, the EU gave a huge grant to people to study in Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Macedonia, and Lebanon. I don't know what the conclusions are, but there are still people who study power sharing. So it's not going anywhere, unfortunately. It's just not, well, I cannot say unfortunately, I live in a power sharing country, so not live, power sharing. Finally, on the multiplicity, I think that, because what I was trying to highlight is actually this problem of romanticizing the local, or actually distinguishing it even between the international and the local. And then as long as we romanticize the local and this idea of local ownership, we will not see any progressive voices or voices of reconciliation, which is what Ernesto was touching on as well. Voices of reconciliation which might be there but might not have the platform. So thank you for not saying that.
But you forgot one thing, like EU in every problem in the Balkans saying that we are very concerned and hope the best for the Balkans.
Of course,
this
yes,
is
yes.
a very
Yes.
Crucial EU response for
This
all
is
the
true.
problems in the Balkans.
Yeah.
It's very
Yes.
effective, very amazing words. Bahar, please. Yeah, like going like that if you don't mind. Absolutely. We're going the also list to the last page.
So, thank you so much for the questions. I'll try to answer them briefly. So about the cartographers and the political agendas in the Iraqi case, I mean, I definitely see it, especially after the First World War, how they draw the borders are really a mystery to me. Especially if you look at, Syria, Turkey, Iraqi border, you can see like even families were, left in 2 different countries, and although they speak the same language, like the cousin is now Syrian and the other ones are Turkish. So it's really arbitrary in a way how it worked out in the Kurdish case. When it comes to the border between Kurdish Autonomous Region and the rest of Iraq, it's also still disputed, and there have been a lot of population engineering throughout the time. So the areas which were Kurdish populated are now, the majority of the population is Arab, and also oil is a big issue, etc. So I don't see any new borders drawn in the short run, at least. When it comes to consociationalism, I know what you mean because I'm teaching it, and I used to teach more courses at work before I was in country, and when I ask my students to choose, to focus on advantages and disadvantages, almost all of them would focus on disadvantages because they were judging this theory from today's perspective and they just couldn't believe that it would work, But I still think that it has its merits, but maybe we're coming up with, more insights into what might happen if we apply this to real life. And I see it has its problems in Iraq, the power sharing perspective. When it comes to the genocide issue, so I have witnessed how they actually problematized this and how they lobbied European Parliament for this. I was there when the bill passed in the Swedish Parliament. I was there when they erected a monument in the Netherlands. So I actually followed these processes very well. I think one issue that's different from the Armenian case in the Iraqi Kurdish case is that the Iraqi High Tribunal already called this a genocide, and Saddam has fallen. But the Iraqi Kurds could never have their closure with the regime because the regime has changed, and suddenly you can't find the perpetrators, you can't find who to blame, you can't. But still in the diaspora, there are some businessmen who supplied chemical gas to the Saddam regime. So they're going after these perpetrators. But there is this really realistic side. There are still mass graves. Every day they find something new. And, this is like the tragic narrative. But when it comes to the high politics, they lobby governments and they take a lot of advice from Israel and the Armenian examples is because they see that these are sort of successful cases which brought self-determination in the end and which helped them to have a cause. So in the Kurdish case, I think the KRG politicians are very cautious about putting those claims. So when they talk about the genocide, they usually separate it from the independence case. But they want the whole rest of the world know that they are a nation which is subjected to genocide. But the national narrative is not built on victimhood. It's based on this Kurdistan like a phoenix, from the ashes, it's resilient, and there's a lot of resistance there. So they actually turned this into a positive thing. And now they created this Kurdistan memory project. They will erect a huge museum at the center of Helder, the Erdi, and it will represent past and future and so on. So they get a lot of support from those cases I mentioned about. When it comes to the independence of Turkey and Iran reacting to these claims, so I think that the Kurds now understood that, again, they have no friends but the mountains. That's like a typical Kurdish saying. So it's because, I think they did not expect that the international community will abandon them so easily, especially after they became the boots on the ground against the Islamic State. But actually, nobody supported their claims. And so they now know that they have to have a functioning federalism, Obama's words, with the Iraqi central government to move forward. And they need France. They are sort of surrounded by hostile states, and they have to make friends, especially Turkey, in order to survive economically, not politically. So Iran and Turkey were the first countries which immediately reacted negatively to a potential referendum. And Turkey, especially when they hear about unsolved genocide, I haven't seen any negative reaction from politicians because they don't necessarily support Saddam in this regard. So I think if they might even bring it to the Turkish parliament one day because they have good relations with the KRG. When it comes to Iran, it's different. And when it comes to PKK stance, so PKK's new ideology is all about not having a nation state nowadays. It's all about democratic autonomy, following what Ari told us last week. So they have a lukewarm approach for KRG stands for self-determination, but they still made a press release and supported the claim.
Thank you so much, Carli.
Yeah. So, just for reference, I reminded me of a very, very good lesson. Just always read the game and never lift anything if you don't know where it's coming from. This map came from the Library of Congress actually, and is used in a non-trivial portion of their official documentation. So I think you spoke a little bit to the identity questions. Obviously, religion and ethnicity are not overlapping circles on a Venn diagram, right? But part of what is interesting to think about this is sort of the distinction that is drawn between analytical categories for the purpose of academia and lived experience of people on the ground, right? Because if we think about the imagined community functions, language changes over time, and we don't have really good survey data, partially as a function of not having a census prior to very recently, because survey data relies on estimation of a known population, right? When you don't know what the population is, all you know is that genocide has obviously fundamentally changed the distribution of the population, and you're unclear about the underlying parameters that it's possible to do survey work. I would be really, really interested in survey questions that try and tap the extent of the overlap in ethnic and religious identity. I first did field work in Bosnia in 2003 and last did it, or not, that's a lot, 2013.
Really?
There we go. And did my last round in 2017. And this is a non-representative population, but the interviews that I've done suggest that there's probably a tighter coupling between those two identities in younger generations, actually, whereas in older generations, there was, and people did distinctly separate those categories of identity. And so I would imagine that they are coming together. Annex 8 of the Dayton Accords also lays out provisions for preservation of symbolic and cultural heritage. And it seems to me that as that has facilitated a lot of ways, like that has laid the parameters for imagined communities that reinforce these distinctions, or that conflate these distinctions across time and space. So that's just what I was saying.
We were in the region at the same time.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I don't have my field work at the same time. Small world.
It's a small world.
It would have been if you met.
That's right. I don't have too much more to add. I think a lot of the points have already been made about identity. It's clear that identity is fluid, and so the interesting question, at least for the purposes of kind of this conversation, is how political elites and also institutions, just through their kind of standard channels, actually help solidify or create certain identities and ossify them. And so the challenge becomes, how do we establish possibility so that these things aren't so heavily ossified and formalized or reified, whatever you want to call it, so that effectively politics is organized around it. And it's particularly problematic when it's the politics, the political identities that emerged very strongly during or right after the war, when these things are still in place much afterwards. So this is where a lot of the criticism of consociationalism come in. There are obviously strong arguments in favor of consociationalism, especially from the perspective of protecting minority groups, who have some territorial coherence and some kind of strong distinctions from the majority group. So there's a reason why this stuff exists, right? If we were having this conversation 100 years ago, that's the conversation we'd be having, talking about group rights rather than so much as individual rights. You know, I was struck by, Asha, what you said about maps. It's absolutely sure, you know about this, you read about maps, but maps effectively, as I think of it at least, do two things. They're analytical tools, but they're also constituent tools, right? They constitute, they create, rather than only describe the way the world is. I took a graduate seminar called Maps and Clocks once, and one of the best classes I ever took in graduate school. And it was quite eye-opening to see kind of the way in which not only colonial powers create identities in this way, but also the way that maps are created as kind of form resistance as well. I guess one thing I'll say, just two brief points. One thing I'll say about this idea, as you noted about the Anfal campaign and the Kurdish genocide kind of tied to Armenia and then onwards, that's something that's actually quite common, right? There's this logic of equivalence. That is, if you look at the original debates around the Armenian genocide in the 1970s and early 80s, there was always an attempt at trying to explain the Armenian genocide in the light of the Holocaust. That's how you knew it was a genocide, right? How is it a genocide? Well, look, you know, the Holocaust had these features and the Armenian experience had these features, therefore it's the same. So there was always this, the Holocaust was always the North Star, so to speak, about these types of discussions. That's expanded. Armenia is, outside of Turkey in some respects, is recognized as a genocide, especially over the last 10 years. So today you see a lot of cases that have a more ambiguous place in genocide discourse, connecting themselves to the Holocaust, Armenia, and Rwanda. Those are the big three that help organize one's relative understanding of one's experiences, one's kind of individual experiences. So there's this logic of equivalence that kind of exists. It's kind of one, A is like B, B is like C, etc. The last point I'll make about what Marcus said before he left, he made this really interesting point about a kind of anxiety towards difference running through several of our presentations. And I think that's quite right, because the challenge here is how does one move, just to think of it practically, from institutional mechanisms that reinforce singularity towards institutional mechanisms that allow for plurality. You mentioned the fact that in Israel Palestine, there's all these fluidities of identities. It's the same thing in Northern Ireland. It's the same thing in all of these cases where we have a tendency to reduce identities to certain categories that effectively risk reproducing the discourse of the agents of violence, right? That's a big problem here. How do we do this? It's actually really, really hard because, as you pointed out, it's difficult to envision what it would mean to open up the possibility of politics in such a way that doesn't recognize these communal identities with all of their internal complexities and all their. I mean, there's a reason why there's multiple political parties within each one of these groups because they have different attitudes towards identities as well as more prosaic political issues. So it's difficult to kind of envision that. That's the way forward, but that's the easy answer. The hard answer is to figure out what this actually entails. I would only add one little codicil to this. As our colleague John Paul Lederach used to say, how long does it take to resolve a conflict? Well, however long it took to kind of make the conflict. We are how many years out since the end of a conflict, whether you think of it in 95 or kind of 98 or 2000, not that far, right? These things take a really long time. If we were having this conversation in the South of the United States and we started talking about the American Civil War, we'd remember that in the South, many people call it the War of Northern Aggression, right? And that was a long time ago. So these conflicts can take a really long time to play out. Now, there have to be institutional responses. There has to be efforts in civil society at problematizing issues of historical memory, collective identity, et cetera. But we also have to be a bit sanguine, a bit realistic about the time frame on this. And that's a non-trivial one.
Some of the participants of this conflict in Yugoslavia say, oh, 1995, no, you have to go back to the 14th century. This is
1389, right? The battle of Kosovo.
Exactly.
This
Right.
is
So that's going to take a while.
Yeah, that's a long time ago.
Thank you very much, all, and I have to meet up new, more optimistic panels. Thanks a lot.
This is optimistic.
This was great.
Thank you for moderating.
Thank you so much for organizing.